and scientists created the Society for Learning about Earth's Mysteries and Enigmas. Since 2003, he's been the editor-in-chief of several scientific magazines. He's also written several books on his own. And for over 2 decades, he's been collecting and analyzing scientific data on several different aspects of the unknown, combing through archaeological discoveries, examining the megalithic structures and underground ruins of the world, and cross-referencing the hard evidence with mythology and legends to get a clearer picture of the past. You can find much of his work at his fascinating website, earthbeforeflood.com. I'm very lucky to be speaking with him through Silvier today. Alexander, welcome to the show.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, for sure, man. It really is an honor and a pleasure to do this, and I think there are great researchers all over the globe, and when we can get past the language barrier, we can learn about ideas and perspectives that might not be on the radar of as many English-speaking guests that I could have. And I've really loved what I've been reading on your website since Silvier recommended it. You deal with a lot of underground complexes and the potential of beings down below, which are topics always near and dear to my heart. And you deal with time periods that are really hard to fathom, tens of millions of years in many cases. But how would you introduce the totality of your research to a group who might not be familiar with your work?
I'm trying to find out the actual and real history of the human civilization instead of simply repeating what I have been told in the school and in the university.
Fair enough. Definitely a mission that many of us here will respect and appreciate. And to start at the beginning, you write about a hierarchy of generations of gods and creators in the ancient past on your site. And I like how you describe it. You say, in the mythology of the majority of people living on the earth, lots of evidence accumulated that beings similar and not similar to the modern people had lived on Earth until at least 66 million years ago, and that they had much more knowledge of the world than we, had flight vehicles and space stations, traveled to other planets and other galaxies, and possessed technologies and weapons we'd consider magic today. These beings, which legends name gods and demons, have rendered the most direct influence on all of the history of our planet during the Cenozoic period, and not to recognize or hide this fact is inhumanly. I like that. Can you elaborate on the Cenozoic period and what that epoch looks like to you?
My geological studies, by chance, so to say, developed in such a way that the Cenozoic period geological sites are the ones I mostly focused on. This happened to be so since the early years when I was studying in the university, and later on when I started my academic career in the University of Moscow and other institutions. It always happened so that I explored sites of the Cenozoic period, primarily ones of the later Cenozoic. For some 20 years, I did most of my work at this type of sites all over Kamchatka, Chukotka, Asia Minor, and various other regions. So after spending some 20 years on various expeditions at primarily Cenozoic sites, I think I can say that I'm well familiar with the aging patterns of these types of rocks. Now, how did I come to the conclusion that during the Cenozoic period there were human or other intelligent societies flourishing on our planet? They were advanced, they had their flying vehicles, they were also driving cars and so on. I believe that they had big cities very much like us. For example, in his work entitled Lemuria, the famous Rerich describes the end of the Mesozoic period, when the earth was still inhabited by dinosaurs, as the time when the race of the so-called Sons of the Wisdom landed on our planet. More or less the same time frame is mentioned in the myths of other cultures, for example in the Slavic context, that is Chernobog, and in the Vedic context, Rig Veda, Mahabharata, and so on, that's Vritra. And all of them landed on Earth when big reptilians were still walking the land. After landing on Earth, we hear from the Vedic literature that the Adityas, those who landed, that's how they are called in the Vedas, they entered a fierce battle with the local reptilian residents, and the absolutely same story we hear from the Slavic sources. Over there, the party of Svarog fights the reptilians. The battle took place in the skies, in the air, but it resulted in a disaster for the full planet, a naturally brought cataclysm, the only escape from which would be underground. Very similar scenarios we find in the traditional myths of Scandinavia, Sumeria, and Iran. And in all of them, always this element is present, that the first settlers on Earth came from outer space exactly at the time when big reptilians were walking the Earth. And this is the best way to approximately date this first arrival. So it seems the first human-like settlers landed somewhere in deep antiquity, towards the end of Cretaceous period, maybe some 70, 75 or even 65 millions of years ago. But they were not the only wave of settlers that came to our planet. For example, in a number of old myths, we hear about another wave of reptilian-like newcomers who lived partially on land and partially in the water. Some out of the numerous examples in this group would be the Sumerian god Enki and the Native American goddess of Chalchutlikue. Then yet another group called Daityas arrived. They were human-like in terms of looks, but they were demoniac in nature. According to the myths, all kinds of interesting creatures were also on Earth at that time. Some of them had many hands. There were enormous flying snakes, giants, chimeras, and many others. Now, from the point of view of a geologist, I wanted to make some sort of parallel between the timings of these waves of settlers from space that were coming to Earth and somehow tie them up to the known geological periods and the catastrophes that occurred. And I immediately noticed that the number of these conflict-caused cataclysms is same as the number of great cataclysmic periods known to us. So after attaching the historical data of the myths to the geological timeline of Earth, I found out that actually the Neogen period was particularly rich in intelligent activity on Earth. Part of the Neogen period, and in particular the middle and the end of the Miocene period, namely some 15 to 5 million years ago, was a time particularly rich in culture and human activity. And it seems that most of what we call fairy tales and myths actually reflect events that took place at that time. It was a time when elves and gnomes and all kinds of exotic serpents lived around. And indeed, in the layers, geological layers to that time, we find really lots of ruins of buildings. And not only buildings, the layers, the geological layers belonging to that period are extremely rich in vehicle tracks, and such tracks can be found on almost all continents.
Yes, the tracks are very interesting. I've seen them on your website. Definitely something you are known for analyzing. And I do like that you write about werewolves, fairies, demons, lizard people, serpent beings, and a lot of other creatures usually thought to be fantasy or mythology, but you're not shy when it comes to writing about these beings as if they were real. It's interesting to me. What do you think are the best arguments or the best evidence that these were real beings on the earth and not just fantasy like academic authorities tell us?
There was that old movie about the unicorn, and the slogan of the movie was, "Whatever you believe in, that's the reality." But this is more of a poetic answer, I know. Well, in the case of the large reptilian inhabitants of former Earth, we have an abundance of archaeological findings, and those are the skeletons of various what we call dinosaurs. Moreover, we have all kinds of varieties of dinosaurs. Some of them live on land, others swim in the seas, and yet others fly in the skies. And the same are the descriptions of the reptilian dragons. That's how they're called in the context of what usually people call myths. These are simply different words for the very same thing. And by the way, the most recent related dinosaurs discoveries point towards the fact that dinosaurs also survived the great catastrophe, at least to some extent, and some remains were dated to 55 million years ago. And a very interesting dinosaur-related case was reported from me by a business owner from Laos. So what happened over there was actually that a Japanese team of scientists performed dating on dinosaur remains, and those showed results of only 17 million years of age. When the news came out in the scientific community, another American team arrived on the spot and put a ban on the information so that people don't get confused, you know. But I personally had my friends, the business owners, visit the local museum and inquire about everything in detail, and that is the source of my information. In terms of beings with many hands, no, we don't have any confirmed findings in terms of bones, for example, but the parallels in the myths of variously supposedly unrelated cultures are too many to be just a pure coincidence. For example, we hear about the ancient Chinese giant Qi Yu. He was flying, he had also many hands, and he was flying on a chariot in the skies, very much like the Indian demon Ravana. And in China, he is straightforwardly considered as somebody who landed from space. Also, the myths of the Sumerians, the Greeks, and even Native Americans are abundant with this type of creatures. For example, the Hopi Indians, without any doubt, consider themselves descendants of a space traveler, something like a spider woman. She also had many hands. And in terms of chimeras, it seems that they lived even in the not so far away past. For example, Saint Bartholomew was a contemporary of Christ, and he himself had the head of a dog. Bartholomew the Apostle was highly respected by Christ himself. He was a preacher of the true faith, and even up to the 15th century he was depicted on the church frescoes the way he really looked like. And only after that point this started to be considered inappropriate, and subsequently he was depicted with human head. In terms of tribes consisting of people with dog heads, we also see such historic records in the travels of the Alexander the Great, his conquests. They were particularly mentioned as fierce warriors that are very difficult to defeat. Also, there is abundance of accounts of kind of human-like but amphibian creatures. It seems they were very common, and they were as often mentioned as those so-called white gods. They are literally everywhere in China, in Japan. Even the brother of the sun goddess Amaterasu was one of them. The legend of the Mayan tribes are also full of such type of accounts of amphibian creatures. Amongst them would be the Fomorians of Ireland, of course. And in Egypt, it's interesting, amphibian creatures were ruling Lower Egypt parallel at the time when the race of the white gods was ruling Upper Egypt. And as if by some rules, always some sort of an amphibian creature would intermarry somebody from the white gods, and the offspring, the result of such an union, would become a ruler of the Mayas, the Sumerians, the Chinese, the Japanese, always the same story. So the myths of nations divided by oceans tell the same story, even in minor details, and this cannot be the result of a pure coincidence.
Well, you are right. The similarities in stories are hard to ignore, but I wonder if there might not be another explanation for how such ideas could cross the ocean, because we know that entheogens and psychedelics were much more common in cultures of the past. What's described on DMT trips today are also very similar types of hybrid beings to what was described then. And maybe in the past our connection was so much stronger to them that it was more of a physical thing. But is it possible that these monsters and chimeras and creatures that people were seeing and describing and writing about weren't literally on the earth but were more shamanic in nature?
I think they had very real forms and bodies like ourselves, because the depictions of them mixing amongst the historic figures are abundant in Laos, in India, in all this South Asia. In the Buddhist temple, they are accepted as absolutely real saints. Their statues are found and worshipped along with the statues of Buddha himself. In Laos, in Cambodia, people worship them so wholeheartedly. They bow before them, hug them, pray to them, as much as they do to Buddha. At a certain location in Mekong, once per year, on a certain day of the lunar calendar, the Nagas, the serpentine creatures, that's how they call them, they still live under earth. So on this particular day, they send to the surfers balls of fire. And this is an event of the magnitude of the miracle of the holy fire in Orthodox Christianity.
Good points. It's compelling, but I think there is a way for these entities to be well-defined and widely depicted and heavily worshipped and have them still be shamanic in nature, or something like Crowley's Lam. But to talk more about the Earth in the ancient past, within the Cenozoic period, it seems like we have smaller chapters that we can examine. Can you talk to us about the Paleocene and Paleogene periods from 65 to 34 million years ago? What was the world like then? Was this the Golden Age people refer to? I know you mentioned a water vapor envelope that covered the globe, which sounds a lot like the plasma envelope talked about in the electric universe model. But what can you tell us about how the Earth was different back then?
When we speak about the Paleogene and the Paleocene, first of all, they are considered to be relatively well studied due to the extensive drilling related with the oil industry, drilling in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. So what is extremely interesting is that the climate was same all over the planet. We didn't get at that time those climate zones like now, equatorial, subequatorial, tropical, subtropical, and so on. That did not exist. The temperature was pretty much stable, between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius, on what we now call Arctic. Magnolias were flowering, palms were growing, tortoises and crocodiles were roaming around. This is not some sort of hypothesis, it is pretty much a proven fact, because we're drilling so much all over the place, and the remains of such plants and animals are coming up in great abundance. And I personally don't find any other reasonable explanation besides the one that the full Earth was covered by a vapor envelope, so to say. Some American researchers even go further exploring this hypothesis. They not only talk about this vapor envelope, but also they suggest that there were rings around the Earth as well. So native people from all around the world talk about a bygone golden age when the climate on the full planet was very mild and pleasant. All the food was growing by itself just because nature was so rich and abundant. So such descriptions very correctly depict the time when the Earth possibly had this vapor envelope around, which was creating such favorable conditions. And this is the only known period in the history of the world where such a golden age could have existed on a global scale. Because according to the myths, this was a worldwide golden age. And if there were some other minor golden ages, they would have been more of a local periods and not on a global scale. And since the sons of wisdom, as Roerich called them, or the Adityas according to Mahabharata, landed on Earth during the Mesozoic period, it fits this picture very well. Yes, then they could have lived in this world of natural abundance and pleasant global climate. And the situation with the continents is quite interesting at that time. There was no Arctic seas at that time. It was all one continent, stretching all the way from current America to nowadays Gobi and Tibet. There wasn't even Tibet at that time. It was all submerged. Actually, various seas started forming in the Arctic region only 55 million years ago. It happened gradually, and only then this continent that was known as Laurasia before that started cracking, the seas started appearing, and gradually it started all looking what we see on the famous map of Mercator. And this is the exact same story that we hear from Mahabharata, from the Sumerian own history, from the myths of Iran. There were these white gods, and they lived in the north. They say explicitly it was in the north. The nature was giving everything in abundance. The life was like, for our standards, something like an eternal holiday. They lived in peace and harmony and coexisted with various huge reptilians / dragons or dinosaurs. It was very interesting because when I saw once artistic depiction, the idea of an artist, how the Earth would have looked like at the time that it had this shield or envelope of vapor, it strongly reminded me of the depictions that we have of the planet Uranus. Then I started researching about the Uranus. Moreover, it's got those rings, and the Earth might have had such as well, according to the hypothesis I mentioned earlier. It turned out that Uranus has got a hard core, as hard as our Earth, and then on the outside it's got this envelope. So all we know about Uranus is not direct. Of course, these are still models of what we think it is, but they say inside it is pretty small, and it rotates independently of this outer covering. We don't really know what is this covering made of, but it is entirely possible that it is made of air, and it does create this greenhouse effect the envelopes have on the planet below. According to results delivered by American space expeditions, they report that on the edge of this shield around Uranus, temperature of some 20 degrees Celsius supposedly were reported. So it is entirely possible that although the planet is relatively far from the sun, the conditions below this shield are very pleasant actually to live, even according to our standards. Also, there is a good number of myths suggesting that at the time when the Earth was embraced by this vapor shield, it was also located somewhat further from the sun than it is currently.
Interesting. So I'm trying to go about this fairly chronologically, and this brings us up to the Neogen period, which is considered to be 23 million years ago down to 2.5 million, which is apparently 10 million years after the Golden Age period. I mean, so much can happen in these kind of time spans, but this Neogene period is the place where you date a lot of the underground tunnels and complexes to, and I think they are amazing. But what happened leading up to this period that caused all this underground construction we see?
Well, I must say that the beginning of the Neogene period definitely stands out as very interesting. That would be some 23 to 17 millions of years ago. So, for some reason, the surface of our planet at that time became as hot as Venus. Even the gods could not live on it. And some of them returned even to heaven. And then as we try to recreate the situation from various myths from all around the world, we have the Earth with dark and light half. It's really not clear. Did it stop rotating, or somehow the axis was horizontal? How could such effect be achieved? It's not really clear. In other words, half of the planet was permanently in light and half of it permanently dark. But the most drastic changes in history start afterwards, when this vapor disappears, and then people can see a blue sky, they can see the sun, they can see the moon and the stars, but also the full race seems to be somewhat downgraded. They start, or let's say we start living much shorter, and for example we start delivering our babies in usually horrible pain, while before that it was quite easy. In other words, the bodies of the humans before that were nearly immortal, that long they lived. But after these drastic changes, we become the mere mortals we are nowadays. And then, judging from, again, lots of myths all around the world, somehow the full saga started developing much faster, and people started organizing wars, fighting each other. And all these wars are quite well described in the myths. And I must say that I do see some geological confirmation for them, because in the layers, geological layers, when they must have occurred, we always see some sort of cataclysms. That's how they look from geological perspective.
Right, so we're dealing with such ancient time periods, it's hard to get into details, but it seems like we weren't alone. We had this period of a golden age with a protective and accommodating atmosphere, and then something radical happened to completely change the environment, but intelligent beings and humanoids and humans, I guess, still survived, and because of the harsh new conditions, they built these vast systems underground, and I'm just fascinated with these underground structures and the idea of pathways to hidden lands inside the earth. Do you think any of these tunnel systems and underground complexes you've studied lead to these places they call Shangri-La or Agartha?
Yes. In the midst of nations on all continents, we hear about wars so terrific that after that, people had to hide underground to remain alive. And indeed, we see a massive amount of entire network of underground cities stretching on almost all continents in the region of South Europe, just full of them. And then going all across Asia, China, Japan, everywhere. Recently, I saw also an amazing footage, so they are in South America as well. In Turkey, they are found in great abundance, and they are better known. Those sections of them here in Russia, we have them in Crimea. Usually they have many floors, and almost none of them are well studied. We never reach the bottom. We never dig so far. For example, in South America, they stretch all the way from Colombia to Chile, and sometimes they are isolated attempts to dig a little bit, but nobody has reached any bottom so far. For example, in Nevada de Cachi in Argentina, people constantly hear the noise of some sort of motor or machine coming from the depth of 1 kilometer. And the very same thing is reported, or at least a very similar thing is reported below the Eskikkerman underground city here in Russia. At places it reaches some half-kilometer depth, and over there in the deep, people can constantly hear the noise of as if trains are passing by. I have also read reports from Czech Republic and Poland. Also very strange, some sort of mysterious underground tunnels going unknowing. Nobody knows where they go, and some sort of vehicles come in and out of them. What are these tunnels? Nobody knows. So are they stretching as far as going even below oceans and connecting continents? That I have no way to find out. Or do they even connect to a possible hollow earth inside? I don't know. Usually it is considered that the classical geology cannot go along with the idea of hollow earth, but in recent times there are geologists who are trying to prove that both ideas can coexist.
Also, I know there are several stories of underground cities found in North America where strange artifacts have been found, and they say the bones of giants, too. Have you looked closer at any of these stories?
Well, actually, you, Greg, you must know better about that because you're in the area. All I can point out as a source of information was that, was it an Iranian official who reported that there has been, let's say, official information, if I can put it in such words about some tunnels where beings of Nordic looks regularly come out in the open. According to that Iranian report, they were in touch with our earthly governments and indeed were governing those governments, but how reliable is that information? I myself don't know. And interestingly enough, Admiral Richard Byrd, during his famous expedition to Antarctica, might have met that very same Nordic-looking race of beings. And basically, they are one-to-one with the description of the race of the white gods, which race we mentioned many times already. And according to the myths, it is exactly this race of the white gods that was forced to hide in underground cities after a terrific catastrophe that, according to my dating, occurred some 34 million years ago.
Wow, that is interesting. And one amazing example of these tunnel systems that you write about is in Tibet, where you say, amazing underground structures and caves created by nature and man-made tunnels and cavities apparently are located under the palace, the residence of the Dalai Lama, in Potala, located in the Tibetan capital. I mean, this is super intriguing. Is there anything else you can tell us about this particular pathway?
Actually, the entry to Agartha is supposedly somewhat south of Potala, somewhere in Mongolia, as described by Ossendowski. When the Hyperboreans left their land, supposedly they separated into two groups, the on-land kingdom of Shambhala and the underground kingdom of Agartha. It is hard to say at this point, is that true or not. I myself use as a source the work of Sergei Volk. He's going on expeditions in those regions. According to the locals in that area, the king of Agartha sometimes comes out on the surface and moves openly amongst people. This has happened 5 times until now. He rides on a white elephant, and by the way, this is a well-known attribute of Lord Indra. And Indra happens to be the king, the supreme ruler of the Adityas. In the Hindu context, Adityas are the good gods. So possibly they are still ruling us, they are looking after us in one way or another. Maybe we indeed do live amongst gods still. It is entirely possible that this underworld of Agartha is much better than our world here on the top.
Maybe, yeah. I do like entertaining those possibilities, and Tibet seems to have a reputation for mystical and superhuman abilities, magic in a sense, you could say. I know you've written about this, but what are your thoughts on Tibetan magic, and does it have anything to do with the connection to beings underground, perhaps? Might they still have some type of link or contact?
Yes, as I wrote in one of my articles, too much evidence is piling up from various sources pointing towards a civilization that practically coexists with us currently here, and they seem to have settled under the earth, also under the oceans, and on the moon. A few times I was in touch with people who seemed to know more about it and promised to tell me, but each and every time something happened and they couldn't. Possibly it is forbidden currently to spread such information.
Yes, it definitely seems frowned upon, but I still love it. Another underground country, Agartha, you say is probably under the Gobi Desert in Mongolia and China, possibly Tibet and the Himalayas also. what more can you say about Agartha, or maybe any information you might have that relates to underground worlds? This is one of my favorite subjects, and what we hear just seems to be so limited.
Recently, an Ukrainian colleague of mine from Kharkov sent me a very interesting book describing face-to-face encounters with residents of the underworld. It seems there are entrances to those realms in UK, in Poland, and various other locations. And some people have met entities of advanced technology. Others met entities which were hostile, reptilian type. It is entirely possible that we have a fully populated world below us in the ground. For example, some friends from Tajikistan were telling me something very interesting. When there are very heavy rainfalls, after that, in really small brooks, in high mountains, large fish appears, meter or even much longer. So this is a pretty large fish. It doesn't thrive in such small brooks. Where does it come from? In the high mountains. It is not a low place that it could have reached there easily. It's entirely possible that it actually comes from the underworld.
Yeah, that very well could be. Land and water passages to habitable places underground are just so interesting to me, and we have to talk about Antarctica a little bit too. Here's what you wrote about it. One of the most mysterious and least explored areas of the Earth is Antarctica. In recent years, there have been found numerous subglacial lakes with warm water and interconnected systems of tunnels where, according to information from various sources, these tunnels are quite numerous, ongoing at a depth of 3 to 4 kilometers underground, and it's even possible to get to other parts of the globe. Now, that's what I'm talking about. What kind of sources do you find credible that tell us about these tunnels?
Yes, the existence of Lake Vostok is fully confirmed, and yes, various sensors have determined that there are warm temperatures there. It is supposed that there are some sort of primitive organisms as well. But the rest of the interesting stuff that you are asking about, I really don't know, and it is not my specialty either, so I could have even missed out some information on this topic.
That's fair, but I was glad to read that you find it a bit mysterious too. This is also a bit outside of your wheelhouse, but maybe we can tie it in. You wrote about this other place, Nevado de Carchi. I think it's in Brazil, if I got that right, but you mentioned it's one of the areas of, quote, maximum UFO activity that attracts researchers from all around the world. Can you tell us more about that area? Do we find vast underground systems there as well?
Well, I was under the impression that this is actually Argentina, but you are closer to those regions, Greg, so your information could be more correct than mine. But anyhow, this is a region with a high concentration of UFO sightings, and as we mentioned, people hear some sort of machinery working below the Earth's surface, and the same thing we have in Skikkerman. I don't know if they see flying objects above Skikkerman, but interestingly enough, currently I'm in correspondence with a lady from Spain. We are organizing an expedition in that region, and she has been telling me that regularly in certain regions of Malaga, flying objects rise as if from the ground itself.
And when we're talking about sustained underground civilizations, people might be inclined to wonder about the viability of that. How could beings survive and thrive underground? How can they grow crops? How can they get around without sunlight? You know, these kind of things. Some stories do talk about a strange glow, and I know you wrote about that as well. What's that about?
As far as the glow is concerned, most definitely yes. I have heard about it from Professor Dr. Yuri Zubritsky, who is honorable member also of the Peruvian Academy of Sciences. So he has seen himself a number of entries to the underground tunnels in South America, and in a number of instances he most definitely reported seeing the glow. Some local people say it is seen in the areas where treasure is buried. That glow has got somewhat of a bluish hue, and it is reported also in the underground tunnels below Tibet and other places. Apparently there is some source of light that we are unaware of. It could be also some sort of technology functioning on a principle totally unknown to us. The Tibetan Lama, somewhat of a controversial person, Lamson Krampa, he claims to have been in some of these underground chambers, and he says that he descended there and he described a spherical ball that was the source of this glow. But anyhow, it is absolutely possible to grow plants under artificial light. At one point in the past, I myself had a lot of indoor plants, and I was very curious if I can grow them in such conditions. I made my own experiments. What kind of light do they like? I made my own grow lights, and for example, some citrus fruits, they were growing under my lamps much faster than they would grow out there in the garden, actually. The plants were absorbing red, blue, and purple light. They were not interested in the green or yellow one.
Right on. I've got some indoor plant growing experience of my own, actually. And we started this by talking about these super ancient time periods, these blocks of millions of years. And that's because you talk about these man-made tunnel systems being products of that Neogene period. How can we get reliable dates for things thought to be millions of years old? How can we make that calculation accurately?
It is extremely hard to date buildings of extreme antiquity. In most cases, the best we can do is when we see that they are covered by later layers, and then we can conclude that they have been there before these layers that are covering them. Other indicators that could give a clue are the degree of erosion, and also if we have mineralization, which also takes a very long time. Those could be indicators as well. For example, the underground cities of Cappadocia can be dated to some extent. They must be older than 5 million years because layers that are considered to be 5 million years old are covering them. And when I say covering, I really mean that in a few locations they are really wrapped around the ruins. They follow their outer shape. So that's why Cappadocia is surely older than those layers on the top of it. Now, how much older, that is another story. While the majority of other historic sites look rather newish compared to the Cappadocia ruins. Just the visual difference is striking by itself. Those that were built during the Middle Ages, or let's say 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, they look visibly younger. They look as if recently built, actually, compared to Cappadocia.
Yeah, Cappadocia is such an amazing site that I would love to see someday. very impressive when you Google pictures of it. But to connect this back to some of the mythology, it seems like the oldest stories talk about the gods and the Nagas and other beings literally going underground. But then later in Irish and Celtic lore, beings like fairies and gnomes are thought to be from underground, but almost in more of a multidimensional sense, like more of a mystical realm. Do you think these stories just changed as they got further from the original source and lost contact with these things? Or is there more of a multidimensional element that we're not considering?
I remember reading extremely interesting field reports in relation to dwarfs. When I started my higher education in geology, I read this research that actually when they started developing mining in the Ural region, it transpired that all the ore deposits are already opened. Somebody has been mining there already. The local people of the region knew about it already because the Chut tribe, which happens to be a tribe of dwarfs, well, that's what they are by profession. They're all miners. They find copper, they dig it out, and they make various copper items. I have also seen that there are very interesting artifacts in Central Asia, silver spears. And they were found in very small tunnels, chambers underground. Of course, the official explanation is that some children, maybe 1 or 2 years old, were actually making and going into these small tunnels. But when you see the actual situation, how small the tunnels are and everything else, it's obvious that the explanations are absolutely ridiculous. Actually, very respectable scientists have conducted numerous expeditions, and they made amazing discoveries connected with this race of dwarfs. Their settlements were found all over the Nordic regions of Russia, and that continued up to the 30s of the last century. More or less that was the time period until they mixed more or less with us, lived in our areas, and after that suddenly all of a sudden they left. Actually, this tribe, this race of dwarfs, locally called Chut, is very well known amongst the native residents of these regions in Siberia. In up to the 17th and 18th century, they maintained regular connections with us. There were messengers, sometimes going backward and forward, exchanging all kinds of information with humans. Also, there were some sort of trade exchange. People would buy copper items from them and give them things that they would be interested in. And all this was, interestingly enough, fully confirmed and very well documented by a number of absolutely respectable scientific expeditions. The reports are still there, but they are not included in the official curriculum of the modern education on geology, simply because it doesn't fit with the official paradigm.
It's a very curious thing when things like that happen, and deception and cover-ups are always angles I like to point out in these kind of things. And a quote that's kind of relevant that I got off your site is, you say that it is necessary for one to find courage in him or herself to acknowledge that a lot of textbooks for schoolboys and students and lectures in colleges and universities are inaccurate. I definitely agree with you there, man. Do you think some of this happens out of ignorance and just not being able to keep up with recent discoveries, or are we purposely misled about our past?
Yes, most definitely this is done on purpose. Just a recent example, now here in Russia, they're introducing a foreign type of education. Well, what does it mean exactly, foreign? They're teaching much less stuff to people, actually, much less. They make them specialists only in a particular area, particular field. For example, we have physicists. Some of them specialize even more only in atomic energy. The geologists, they also don't know full geology. They know only a very small and narrow branch of it. This is done with the purpose to make the people even more narrow-minded and to prevent them from inquiring more into the nature of the world and the reality. Because the less people know, the less they can learn and the less informed they will be about everything. So this is being pushed by purpose now also in our country, ruining the education even further. And another phase of it is sponsoring only research that agrees with the official paradigm, so to say. For example, my latest scientific publication is on the topic of the so-called Ice Age that officially supposedly ended some 12,000 years ago. So when I was opening the maps that were the product of research of very respectable scientific institutions, some over 100 respected scientists have signed below each of these maps, it turns out that they're all useless because the results, the published results, follow dogmas instead of summarizing the data obtained by the actual tests and expeditions and the result of digging. If you read the actual field reports of these very same scientists, you will find out that the mammoths lived in a warm climate. There were deciduous trees now growing in what is now very cold parts of Siberia. Also, in the official conclusion of their work, we see that the climate zones were like now, more or less, just colder supposedly in that period. But in reality, their field results show that they were somewhat tilted because at that time the North Pole was somewhere in Greenland, probably. So the climate zones were also sideways, not what we would call nowadays straight. So all these things you find in their actual field reports. But as far as the conclusions of the excellent work they have done actually, they had to publish something completely different, something that does not correspond to their actual research. And the only reason for this is that otherwise they would lose their job. They would not get paid. Their institution would get closed down. This is the reality. In this way, people are being tricked into believing in all kinds of dogmas, like, for example, that we came from the monkeys and other stuff like this. They believe it because of the authority of the scientists that have signed below that and are still signing. But what people are not aware of is that these scientists are not signing because of their actual research, but because of these financial considerations that I mentioned earlier.
Well, guys, that just about does it for us. I could not be more grateful to both of you. It really is fascinating stuff, and I'm so happy we were able to actually make it happen.
Thank you very much again to all of you, and we wish